Chapter 15. Daring Plans. Dare I go closer? Nancy wondered, watching the woman behind the fence. Just then the old lady awakened and for a moment sat up straight in her wheelchair. "Oh dear," she said. I guess I dreamed I was..." Her wrinkled chin twitched, and she leaned back with closed eyes. Tears crept from under her lids. Nancy was about to speak when she spotted a white figure hurrying down the hill. The nurse! "So there you are," she said harshly, drawing near the old woman. "I thought so. Trying to hide again." A sob escaped the elderly patient. "Come now, stop that crying," the nurse commanded. "If you act like a baby, you will have to be treated like one." The old lady lifted a fragile, blue-veined hand in protest, but let it drop limply. "Very well, Miss Contrary. You may sit there for half an hour," the nurse snapped. "Lucky for you I'm tender-hearted, or I'd take some of your privileges away. See that you're here when I come back." She strode up the hill. As the patient closed her eyes wearily, Nancy edged closer. "Mrs. Eldridge! Mrs. Eldridge!" The old lady's eyes snapped open, and she looked wildly about her. "Here I am on the other side of the fence, behind the trees," Nancy said. "Listen closely. I will bring you help." "How do you know my name? Who are you?" Mrs. Eldridge whispered. Nancy moved closer. Quickly, she told the woman who she was, then explained how she had identified her. Mrs. Eldridge clasped her thin hands. "Bless you, child," she said. "But you can do nothing." "Yes, we can," said Nancy, speaking with confidence. "But you must be brave and ready to follow instructions." Bess and George had moved up to Nancy, who quickly introduced them. "We'll all help you, Mrs. Eldridge," Bess said. "You can trust Nancy," George spoke cheerfully, despite the pain in her ankle. The old woman smiled. "What brave young girls!" Her chin lifted, and a glint came into her eyes. "All right, I'll do my part." Nancy glanced uneasily up the hill. "We'd better stay out of sight while we're talking." The girls stepped back and crouched down behind the brush. "Tell us where your room is," Bess urged. "We'll get you out, then call the police, and they can rush the place." "No, no!" exclaimed Mrs. Eldridge. "We've all been warned that if strangers try to enter the grounds, we'll be locked in the cellar." "The police would find you," George said. "Yes, but some of the women here are heart cases. Many of them could not stand the shock." "Hush! Dr. Bell is coming." "Bell!" thought Nancy, recalling the Bluebell code message. Quickly, the girls slipped back among the trees and watched. Striding down the slope was a tall, distinguished-looking man in a black suit. He had smooth gray hair and a pointed beard. He spoke in honeyed tones to the old woman. "Well, well, what has upset our dear patient?" he asked, bending over and gallantly kissing her hand. "I'm afraid you fret too much. However, I must tell Miss Tyson to be less strict with our favorite guest. Shall I call Luther and have him wheel you through the gardens?" "No, just leave me alone." Mrs. Eldridge sighed. "Yes, that is what you need. Rest and quiet," Dr. Bell agreed. "But," he went on, "we must talk business. Shall we get over that little matter of signing the transfer papers now?" "Your proposition is nothing short of robbery, and I will not consent," Mrs. Eldridge replied, sitting bolt upright. Dear me, how harsh you are, Dr. Bell said soothingly. When you came here, you had every confidence in me. You entered this place of your own accord. You didn't give your relatives any idea where you were going. Didn't you agree to that as part of your treatment? Fool that I was. Yes, snapped Mrs. Eldridge. But you haven't kept your part of the bargain to me or to any of the other ladies. You promised a special secret treatment. So secret you don't want anybody to know about it. That's why you have this isolated place. The special treatment to restore youthful vigor isn't ready yet, Dr. Bell replied. But it will be very expensive. I must have the extra money now. Oh, Nancy thought, he's undoubtedly a fraud. I demand that you let me go, Mrs. Eldridge cried out. We can't do that, Dr. Bell said. It would discredit our sanatorium to have a person leave in a poor state of health. Besides, I have your signed declaration that you are a patient here of your own accord, and that you agree to remain as long as I think necessary. Naturally, I forbid you to go. Mrs. Eldridge glanced quickly toward the woods, where the girls were concealed. In a loud, clear voice, she said, You wish me to sign over to you many thousands of dollars, in addition to the $3,000 I have already paid you. And why not? Dr. Bell retorted irritably. There are other patients whom I have charged more. Well, I suppose that once the papers are signed, I won't live very long, the old lady said meaningfully. You will feel like a girl again, Dr. Bell replied. I'd rather live without youthful vigor and be out of here, Mrs. Eldridge said, closing her eyes. I won't sign a thing. If you should kill me, you won't get a cent. That's all. I wish you would go. I am very tired. Nancy saw the doctor's face turn red. His beard seemed to bristle, and his eyes blazed with rage. You'll sing a different tune if you don't do as I say, he fumed. I've wasted enough time on you. I will give you until 9 o'clock tonight to come to your senses. Oh, you are a brute, Mrs. Eldridge cried. If only some good angel would come to my little room in that hot south corner on the 3rd floor and rescue me. Say, what are you talking about? Dr. Bell asked, looking about him suspiciously. You don't think any angels are listening to your careful directions, do you? The girls could not help grinning. Dr. Bell turned and shouted, Luther! A man in a white uniform came out of the gatehouse. Take Mrs. Eldridge to the porch, the doctor snapped. Any word about the new patient? A message arrived by Bird X that she will be here at 9, the attendant said with a wink as he wheeled Mrs. Eldridge away. Swiftly, the girls made their way toward the car. Nancy took the wheel and headed for the highway. As they drove along, the sun broke through the overcast. We're going to Glenville, she said. It's about 5 miles from here. George can see a doctor there. What about Mrs. Eldridge? Bess asked. No plan yet, Nancy said tersely, but I'm thinking. Her companions asked no more questions. When they reached the small town, Bess went with George, while Nancy telephoned Ned from the drugstore. She told him what had happened and alerted him to his part in the plan she had devised. You can count on me, he said. An hour later, the girls met in a sandwich shop for a late lunch. My ankle isn't sprained, George reported. The doctor put on a bandage and it feels better. Good, said Nancy. Are you ready for danger? She asked soberly. Of course we are, George answered steadily. Anything to get those poor old ladies free and home to their families, Bess added. Then right after we eat, I'm going shopping while you two hire a black sedan. You may have to ride to another town for it, so let's meet here about 5. Then I'll tell you the plan. At the appointed time, Nancy came hurrying down the street, her arms filled with packages. A black sedan was parked at the curb behind her convertible, where Bess and George were waiting. "What did you buy?" George asked in amazement. Nancy grinned. "Black Oxfords, a black hat with a heavy veil, gray gloves, and a long black coat, much too big for me." George's eyes grew wide. "Nancy, you're going to dress up like an old lady." "That's right. I'll be that new patient who is supposed to arrive at 9 o'clock. Only I'll be there early." Bess stared at the parcels Nancy was holding. "What's in that 5th bag?" "A nurse's uniform and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses for you," Nancy said. Bess gasped. "Me?" "Yes, you'll have to drive the car into the sanatorium grounds," Nancy replied. "Oh my goodness," was all Bess could say. Immediately, George offered to go instead, but Nancy said no. "You never can tell what will happen," she said. "With that bad ankle, you wouldn't be able to run if it should be necessary." Nancy put the packages in the convertible and suggested that they eat supper. They found a small restaurant on a side street and ordered hot sandwiches and milk. "What's my part in the plan?" George asked. "I want you to stay with the convertible, in the clearing where we hid it before," Nancy said. "Bess may need your help when she brings Mrs. Eldridge out." George nodded. "I see. I'll play it cool." "But what about you, Nancy?" asked Bess. "You're not going to stay in that awful place." "Yes. We must get Mrs. Eldridge out before 9 o'clock. After that, I'll give the signal for the rescue of the others. A pigeon will carry it to the deserted Tooker estate, where Ned is stationed." Nancy glanced at her watch. "There's no more time to talk now. We must get started." With George driving the convertible and Nancy the sedan, they returned to the clearing near Larkspur Lane. There, Bess changed into the nurse uniform, and Nancy put her costume over her own clothes. Bess, wearing horn-rimmed glasses, looked stern in her white uniform and cap. Nancy seemed small and frail in the long black coat and heavily veiled hat. "I'd never know you!" George exclaimed. 10 minutes later, in the gathering dusk, the sedan reached the gatehouse. "Now remember to give the password," Nancy whispered. Trembling, Bess halted the car in front of the gates as the gatekeeper appeared and chained his Great Dane securely. The huge dog strained at his leash and barked furiously. His master advanced toward the girls. Suppose the password has been changed, Nancy thought fearfully. "What's the good word?" demanded the watchman hoarsely, stepping closer. "Singing horses," Bess whispered, quaking. End of chapter 15.